the 16th of December 1944 at 0730 hours. The operational briefing at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, began with routine language. The overnight summary emphasized continuity, no deviation from established Allied doctrine, no immediate requirement for large-scale maneuver beyond planned axes. The maps on the wall showed clean, linear advances oriented eastward, each army group progressing along defined corridors supported by secure supply lines. The Third Army's frontage was marked as stable, its role fixed by weeks of prior planning. Nothing in the briefing suggested that this framework was about to be challenged. Allied doctrine, in late 1944, rested on accumulation and control. Advances were to be deliberate, supply-driven, and synchronized across adjacent formations. Armor moved only when fuel dumps, bridging units, and maintenance echelons were aligned. Winter conditions amplified these constraints. Snow and ice degraded road surfaces, reduced vehicle speed, and increased fuel consumption by measurable margins. Cold weather also increased mechanical failure rates, a fact repeatedly emphasized in staff studies circulated during November. Any deviation from planned movement required detailed coordination, written orders, and timed at 0815. The weather officer delivered his forecast. The winter storm system was moving east, bringing heavy snow, freezing temperatures, and limited visibility. Across a broad sector, air operations would be restricted. Road conditions would deteriorate rapidly. The forecast reinforced existing assumptions. This was not a period for rapid maneuver. The operations staff annotated the forecast onto the planning board, marking expected delays. The annotations were procedural, not anticipatory. At 0900, the first reports of German activity in the Ardennes sector began to filter into Chef. The reports were fragmented, routed through intermediate headquarters, and initially assessed as local counterattacks. The intelligence section rated them as low to moderate concern. German forces were believed to be exhausted, their armored reserves depleted. The idea that they could mount a sustained offensive in winter conditions contradicted established estimates. The reports were logged, but did not alter the briefing's tone. 80945. Eisenhower reviewed the situation quietly from his position at the table. He asked for clarification on the scale of reported enemy movement. The response referenced doctrine. German forces lacked the logistical capacity for a major offensive. Fuel shortages, damaged infrastructure, and Allied air superiority weather permitting were cited. The explanation was sound within the accepted framework. Eisenhower did not challenge it, but he did not endorse it fully. He requested continued monitoring. By mid-morning, at 10:30, additional reports arrived indicating deeper German penetrations than initially assessed. The reports came from multiple corps headquarters and included references to armored formations. Reliability varied. Some messages were delayed by hours, their timestamps already obsolete. The intelligence section attempted to reconcile the data, but the picture remained incomplete. The doctrine still held. Even if penetrations existed, they would be contained through lateral reinforcement, not wholesale maneuver. At 11:15, the Third Army staff reviewed its own posture. The Army's corps were oriented east and northeast, committed to ongoing operations. Supply lines extended along carefully maintained routes. Fuel stocks were calculated precisely, with little margin for sudden redeployment. Any significant change in direction would require rerouting convoys, reallocating engineer assets, and rewriting movement tables. The staff's internal assessment concluded that a rapid pivot was not feasible under current conditions. At 1200, Eisenhower convened a smaller conference with senior commanders and staff officers. The discussion centered on doctrinal limits. One officer emphasized that Allied success had come from adherence to methodical planning and overwhelming logistics. Another warned against reacting impulsively to incomplete information. The weather forecast was cited again. The consensus, unspoken but clear, was that stability depended on restraint. Eisenhower listened, his notes sparse. By early afternoon, at 13:30, the scale of the German offensive became harder to dismiss. Reports indicated multiple German divisions advancing through wooded terrain, exploiting poor weather in thinly held sectors. The intelligence section revised its estimate cautiously, acknowledging a larger than expected effort. Still, the revised estimate assumed that German momentum would dissipate within days. The assumption aligned with doctrine and past experience. 1415, a critical constraint was raised: road networks. The Ardennes region relied on narrow, winding roads ill-suited for heavy traffic, especially in winter. Engineers warned that congestion, ice, and breakdowns could immobilize columns. A large-scale pivot would risk paralyzing not only the moving force, but also adjacent units dependent on shared routes. The warning carried weight. The maps reflected these constraints with red markings indicating choke points. At 1500, Eisenhower requested a formal assessment of options. The staff outlined three: hold existing plans and contain the penetration, reinforce locally with nearby units, or execute a broader operational adjustment. The third option was presented briefly and dismissed just as quickly. It violated doctrine, exceeded logistical assumptions, and relied on speed under adverse weather conditions. The dismissal was procedural, not argumentative. As afternoon turned to evening, at 16:30, the weather worsened. Snow began to fall steadily, visibility dropping across much of the front. Reports from forward units described icy roads and increasing vehicle casualties due to mechanical failure. The environmental stress reinforced the staff's caution. Movement slowed everywhere. The idea of accelerating movement in such conditions seemed irrational. At 1700, Eisenhower received a direct report indicating that a key road junction was under threat, potentially isolating Allied units forward of it. The report carried higher reliability and included confirmation from multiple sources. The implications were serious. Still, the immediate response proposed was incremental: adjust boundaries, shift limited reserves. The language of the orders remained careful, bounded. By 1800, the accumulated reports suggested a developing crisis, yet the framework for response remained unchanged. Doctrine provided comfort through structure. It defined what was permissible and what was not. A 90-degree pivot of an entire army in winter under enemy pressure fell firmly into the category of the impermissible. At 1900, Eisenhower reviewed the day's logs alone. The operational picture was deteriorating faster than the staff's. Responses: the constraints, weather, fuel, roads were real, but so was the enemy's momentum. Doctrine offered no clear solution. It defined limits without addressing the cost of adherence. The day ended with no decisive order issued. The army remained oriented as planned. The gamble that doctrine discouraged was not yet taken. The consequence of restraint, though not yet visible in full, was already forming. Time lost, options narrowing, and an enemy advancing into the space created by caution. The 16th of December 1944 at 2145 hours. The snow intensified across the Ardennes and central sectors, driven sideways by wind that rattled windows and interfered with radio reception. At 3rd Army Headquarters, the operations room was dimly lit. The overhead lamps casting uneven pools of light across map tables, already crowded with annotations from the day. The weather officer's updated forecast lay open beside the radio. Log: heavy snowfall continuing through the night. Temperatures dropping below freezing. Road conditions expected to deteriorate sharply by morning. The forecast arrived simultaneously with a new wave of reports from the north at 2200. A message from 1st Army confirmed that German armored formations had penetrated deeper than anticipated along multiple axes. The report cited loss of several road junctions and partial encirclement of forward units. Reliability was rated high, based on direct contact and visual confirmation. The message carried urgency, but little detail. Communications were strained, with relays delayed by weather and congestion. The picture was incomplete, but the direction was unmistakable. At 2215, Patton entered the operations room. He had already been briefed informally and required no recap of doctrine. He stood over the map without removing his gloves, listening as the operations officer summarized the situation. The summary emphasized uncertainty, weather constraints, and the lack of confirmed enemy strength. It also emphasized what doctrine permitted. Patton did not interrupt. When the briefing ended, he asked a single question: which German units were advancing and where the roads converged. By 2225, the intelligence officer provided an answer drawn from fragmentary reports. The answer was provisional and carried caveats. Patton accepted it without comment. He traced a finger across the map, following secondary roads leading north. The roads were marked as low capacity, vulnerable to weather, and unsuitable for sustained armored movement. The markings reflected planning assumptions, not current necessity. At 2230, Patton issued his first instruction: prepare to pivot the army north. The room fell silent. The operations officer hesitated, asking for clarification. Patton repeated the instruction, specifying a 90-degree turn, with the 3rd Corps and the 12th Corps reoriented immediately. He did not request confirmation from higher headquarters. He did not ask for additional intelligence. The decision was made on incomplete information, but it was made deliberately. At 2240, staff officers began recalculating movement tables under extreme time pressure. Fuel estimates were revised upward to account for cold weather consumption. Engineers were alerted to prepare bridging and road clearing assets, though many were already committed elsewhere. The logistics officer warned that supply lines would be strained beyond planned limits. Patton acknowledged the warning and instructed him to make it work. The distinction between feasible and necessary was no longer debated. At 2300, the first orders were drafted and transmitted. They were concise, directive, and left little room for interpretation. Units were instructed to disengage where possible, turn north, and move immediately. Priorities were rewritten: speed over preservation, momentum over tidiness. The orders acknowledged weather but did not allow it to delay execution. Columns already on the move were instructed to reroute mid-march, often without full situational awareness. By 2300, reports arrived indicating confusion among subordinate headquarters. Some units requested clarification on routes. Others reported road conditions already worsening. Snow accumulation reduced visibility to meters in places. The signal officer reported increased interference and dropped transmissions. Patton remained at the map table, issuing clarifications verbally, often before written orders could catch up. The decision propagated faster than the system designed to carry it. 0015 hours. The 17th of December, the first elements of the 3rd Corps began. Turning north, the movement was uneven. Some units advanced quickly, others stalled due to congestion and breakdowns. Fuel consumption exceeded estimates almost immediately. Recovery vehicles struggled in the snow. These reports were logged as they arrived, their tone shifting from uncertainty to strain. At 0045, a staff officer raised the question of coordination with adjacent armies. The pivot risked creating gaps elsewhere. Patton acknowledged the risk and instructed that coordination would follow movement, not precede it. The order reversed standard procedure. The consequence was accepted: temporary exposure in exchange for speed. By 0130, Eisenhower was informed of Patton's decision. The message, transmitted through secure channels, outlined the pivot in factual terms. It did not seek approval. It reported action already underway. The language was restrained but unambiguous. Eisenhower's staff requested clarification on timing and scope. The reply indicated that movement had already begun. At 0200, the weather worsened further. Snow clogged. Vehicle intakes and froze loop. Road accidents increased. Units reported delays measured in hours. Despite this, the overall movement continued. The reports reflected attrition and friction, but also persistence. The army was turning unevenly, but irrevocably. By 0300, German reconnaissance elements reported Allied movement, but the scale was unclear. The enemy's assumptions mirrored those previously held by the Allies. Large-scale maneuver in such conditions was deemed unlikely. The advantage lay not in concealment, but in disbelief. At 0415, Patton reviewed updated status reports. Several units were behind schedule, others were ahead. The disparity threatened cohesion. He issued follow-on orders, adjusting routes and priorities, favoring those formations closest to the threatened sector. The adjustments were reactive, made under pressure, and carried risk. Each adjustment committed the army further to the decision. At 0530, first light revealed the cost. Vehicles lined the roads, some immobilized, others abandoned. Engineers worked to clear bottlenecks. Fuel convoys struggled forward, yet the axis of movement was unmistakable. The army's orientation had changed. What doctrine forbade was now fact. By 070, our reports from First Army indicated that German forces had not anticipated a rapid Allied response from the south. The window created by disbelief remained open, but it was narrowing. Time, gained through speed, was now being spent. The decision had been executed without full confirmation, under worsening weather, against established doctrine. Its consequences were immediate: logistical strain, exposed flanks, and mounting losses. But the pivot was complete, in intent, if not yet in position. The army was committed, and the storm had closed in behind it. The 17th of December 1944, at 0615 hours, the temperature across the 3rd Army sector fell to -12 degrees Celsius. The snowfall from the night before had hardened into compacted ice on secondary roads, turning inclines into hazards and intersections into bottlenecks. Reports from the 3rd Corps indicated that tracked vehicles were slipping laterally even at low speeds. Wheeled transport fared worse. Recovery teams were overwhelmed before daylight fully broke. The movement had begun, but it was already degrading under conditions no planning table had modeled accurately. By 0700, the first consolidated movement report reached 3rd Army headquarters, who the divisions ordered north overnight. Fewer than half were unscheduled. Several regiments had not cleared their initial assembly areas due to frozen fuel lines and dead batteries. Maintenance units worked in darkness, hands numb, tools slipping. These delays were logged without comment. There was no instruction to halt. The assumption had shifted. Delay was expected. Stoppage was not acceptable. At 0745, the air liaison officer confirmed what had been anticipated. Air support was unavailable across most of the sector. Low cloud ceilings, snow squalls, and icing conditions grounded fighter bomb. Reconnaissance flights were sporadic and unreliable. The army would move blind, relying on ground reports already hours old. The loss of air observation removed a critical corrective mechanism. Ears would not be caught early. At 0830, fuel consumption. Reports arrived from the 12th Corps. Cold weather usage exceeded estimates by nearly 30%. Engines ran continuously to prevent freezing, even when vehicles were stationary. Supply officers recalculated projections in pencil, erasing and rewriting figures as assumptions collapsed. The margin for error disappeared. Convoys diverted north found themselves competing for road space, with combat units moving in the opposite direction hours earlier. By 0900 communications began to fragment. Snow and ice interfered with antenna performance. Field telephones failed as lines snapped under accumulated weight. Radio transmissions arrived incomplete, often missing grid references or unit identifiers. The signal section attempted to impose discipline, requesting standardized reporting times. The request went largely unanswered. Units reported when they could, not when ordered. At 0945, a division commander reported that his lead elements had taken a wrong turn at a poorly marked junction, following outdated route overlays. The error cost 3 hours and consumed additional fuel. The commander requested updated maps. None were available. The operations officer annotated the error and instructed all units to rely on verbal route descriptions. The adjustment increased the burden on communications already under strain. By 10:30, the first confirmed losses attributable solely to movement were recorded. 2 tanks slid off an embankment and were unrecoverable. Several trucks overturned on icy curves. Casualties were light, but equipment losses accumulated. The losses were logged as non-combat attrition. The distinction mattered administratively, but not operationally. Combat power was diminishing before contact. 8:11:15. Reports from the lead elements of the 3rd Corps indicated sporadic German resistance along the northern routes. These were area security units, surprised and disorganized. Engagements were brief and localized. The enemy appeared unprepared for Allied armor approaching from the south. The reports confirmed that Spieth had achieved surprise, but they also confirmed that contact was inevitable. At 1200, Patton convened a brief staff update. The room was cold, despite heaters running continuously. Condensation formed on the maps. The logistics officer presented revised fuel estimates, warning that several units would reach critical levels within 24 hours if resupply did not accelerate. Patton acknowledged the warning and ordered priority given to forward-moving combat units at the expense of rear services. The order accepted future risk to preserve current momentum. By 1300, the weather worsened again. Visibility dropped sharply. As snow resumed, headlights became the primary navigation aid, creating long, exposed columns visible for kilometers. Blackout discipline was relaxed out of necessity. The risk of detection increased, but movement continued. The choice was explicit: concealment or progress. Progress was selected. At 14:15, Eisenhower's headquarters requested an updated movement estimate. The reply was cautious but firm. The pivot was ongoing, with significant friction, but could not be reversed. The phrasing avoided optimism. It emphasized commitment. The implication was clear. Whatever the outcome, the decision would play out. Fully up by 1500, coordination problems surfaced between corps' boundaries. Units advancing at different speeds created gaps and overlaps. A regiment advanced into an area already assigned to another division. The error resulted in congestion and temporary paralysis at a key junction. Staff officers intervened, issuing ad hoc adjustments. The fixes were imperfect but sufficient to restore movement. At 16:30, fuel convoys began arriving late. Several were delayed by road conditions or diverted to assist stranded units. Combat units reported reducing idle time to conserve fuel, increasing the risk of mechanical failure. Maintenance officers warned that restarting cold engines repeatedly would accelerate breakdowns. The warning was noted. The practice continued. By 17:30, reports from forward units indicated growing German awareness of Allied movement. Resistance stiffened near key road junctions. Anti-tank positions appeared with little warning. Engagements increased in frequency. The window created by disbelief was closing. The cost of speed was rising. 1800, Patton issued a directive emphasizing continued advance regardless of localized resistance. Units were instructed to bypass where possible and leave containment to follow-on forces. The directive formalized a pattern already emerging. It accepted fragmentation in exchange for tempo. The consequences would be felt later. By 1930, darkness returned fully. Movement slowed, but did not stop. Headlights glowed along frozen roads. Engines strained. Radios crackled intermittently. The army advanced in pieces, uneven but persistent. The maps no longer represented intent. They recorded approximation. 2100. A summary report noted that, despite delays, losses, and mounting logistical strain, the majority of combat units were moving north. The pace was slower than ideal but faster than the enemy had anticipated. Certainty had been abandoned. Speed, imperfect and costly, had become the organizing principle. That movement through the impossible continued, not because conditions allowed it, but because reversal was no longer an option. The army pressed forward, trading precision for momentum, accepting attrition as the price of initiative. The consequences of that trade were accumulating, measurable, and irreversible. The 18th of December 1944, at 0830 hours, the Situation Room at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was quiet beyond expectation. The overnight reports had been assembled and arranged in sequence, their timestamps marked in pencil, where radio delays had rendered chronology uncertain. Eisenhower stood at the central table, reading without comment. The room temperature was low, the heating system struggled against the cold, and several officers kept their coats on. No one spoke while he read. The silence was procedural, not reverential. It reflected uncertainty about what conclusions could be drawn. The first reports detailed the scope of the Third Army's movement. Pliff's entire corps had reoriented northward in less than 48 hours. Routes previously designated for eastward advance were now empty. Supply convoys had been rerouted mid-transit. Engineer units were operating beyond their planned sectors. The scale of the maneuver exceeded any model used in Allied operational planning. Eisenhower paused at several entries, comparing reported positions against the maps. The discrepancies were not errors. They reflected speed. At 0905, the Chief of Staff offered clarification on reporting gaps. Several messages from Third Army had arrived hours late, their relevance diminished by subsequent movement. Eisenhower acknowledged the explanation without comment. He understood the limitation. The issue was not accuracy in isolation, but whether the maneuver had achieved operational effect before friction consumed it. By 0930, the intelligence section presented an updated enemy assessment. German forces advancing in the Ardennes had been forced to adjust their axes of movement in response to unexpected Allied pressure from the south. Several German units were reported delaying their advance to secure flanks now threatened. The assessment was cautious, noting that confirmation was incomplete. Eisenhower noted the phrasing. The enemy reaction suggested surprise, but surprise alone did not guarantee success. At 1000, Eisenhower asked for a logistical status update. The logistics officer reported severe strain. Fuel stocks were unevenly distributed. Some forward units were approaching critical levels. Maintenance backlogs were growing. Road congestion persisted. The officer emphasized that the maneuver had consumed resources at a rate exceeding forecasts. Eisenhower asked whether resupply could stabilize the situation within 48 hours. The answer was uncertain. At 10:35, Eisenhower reviewed communications logs. Several coordination requests from adjacent armies had been delayed or overridden by the speed of Third Army movement. The maneuver had occurred without formal consultation. Eisenhower understood this fact clearly. He did not ask why. He asked whether the lack of consultation had caused operational conflict. The response was mixed. Some boundary issues had arisen. None were decisive. By 1100, Eisenhower requested Patton's personal assessment. The message arrived at 1120, transmitted through secure channels. Patton's report was direct. He acknowledged losses, logistical strain, and risk. He stated that delay would have been more costly. He did not frame the maneuver as exceptional. He framed it as necessary. Eisenhower read the message twice. He did not annotate it. At 1145, the senior staff officer raised the issue of command authority. The maneuver, executed without prior approval, challenged established command relationships. If successful, it would validate initiative at the expense of process. If it failed, it would expose systemic vulnerability. Eisenhower listened, then asked for evidence of failure. None could be provided yet. By 1200, new reports indicated that Third Army elements were approaching positions that threatened German supply routes. The timing was critical. What doctrine suggested would require weeks of repositioning had been accomplished in days, under adverse conditions. Eisenhower noted the compression of time. Speed had altered the decision cycle for both sides. At 12:30, Eisenhower convened a limited conference. The discussion was restrained. No praise was offered. No reprimand issued. Eisenhower asked whether the maneuver could be sustained. The answers varied. Some officers believed the momentum could be maintained. Others warned of imminent exhaustion. Eisenhower absorbed both views without signaling preference. At 13:05, Eisenhower made his decision. He issued a directive endorsing the maneuver as executed and instructing all commands to support it fully. The directive emphasized coordination and resupply, not replication. It did not cite doctrine. It did not mention precedent. It addressed the situation as it existed, not as it should have been. By 1345, the directive was transmitted. Subordinate headquarters adjusted priorities accordingly. Resources were redirected. The endorsement transformed an individual decision into institutional commitment. The risk, once localized, became shared. At 1415, Eisenhower reviewed subsequent reports indicating increased German defensive activity in response to the Third Army's approach. The enemy's operational freedom was narrowing. The cost remained high, but the effect was measurable. Eisenhower allowed himself a brief pause, then returned to the reports at 1500. The question of authority resurfaced privately among the staff. Eisenhower addressed it directly. He stated that command authority existed to achieve results, not to preserve procedure. The statement was not rhetorical. It was recorded in the conference notes. The implication was clear. Flexibility, when exercised with responsibility, would be tolerated by late afternoon. At 1630, the situation stabilized marginally. The immediate crisis had not passed, but the Allied response had gained coherence. Eisenhower's role shifted from assessment to support. The decision he made was not to intervene, but to accept the consequences of initiative already taken. As evening approached, Eisenhower reviewed the day's final summary. The maneuver remained risky, losses continued, logistics were strained, yet the enemy's timetable had been disrupted. The outcome was not yet decided, but the terms of engagement had changed. Eisenhower closed the file and issued no further comment. The measure had been taken. Flexibility had rewritten the rules, not through declaration, but through necessity. The authority of command had adapted to the reality imposed by speed. The consequences, now institutional as well as operational, would unfold beyond the reach of doctrine alone.